I was born in a small apartment in a tiny little bathroom in Gretna, Louisiana. I meant it when I said in a tiny little bathroom. My mother was 40 years old. My sisters were away at school that day. We lived in a small apartment, and it was raining. It was a thunderstorm outside that day. My mom didn't have a car. She didn't even have a driver's license. But since I'm one of inconvenience, that's the day that I chose to enter this world. So my mom gave birth to me in that tiny little bathroom, just the two of us, and we sat there for a really long time, just waiting for someone, anyone, to come and check on us to make sure that we were okay. That defining moment. For so many of us, our defining moment is that moment where we come into the world and the circumstances that we are born into. In a way, for many of us, especially in this country, the defining moment means that the book is already written. If the book is already written, the chapters are already laid out, I charge you to answer that question of, does it mean that we don't read that book? We live in a country where, for many of our children, the circumstances that they're born into, the zip code, the address, the single parent, right? The broken home, whatever that may be, it determines so much of what their circumstances can become. But that's not what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is how there are all those subsequent defining moments that come after that, right? I want to think about the stories that happen within those chapters. So eventually we moved out of this tiny apartment when I was 3 years old. We moved from that community to a small house on a peaceful street. My mother and I went to live with my father. My father was 45, my mother was 40, so at that time they were approaching their 50s, and then we could finally be a family. Many researchers would then say that that's the next defining moment, right? We changed the address of that child. We brought them from an apartment into a home. We brought them from a single parent into a family with two parents, and that's the defining moment that's so important for being able to navigate and pivot the circumstances of that child. But again, I tell you, that's actually not the defining moment that I want to talk about. So for many of us, there's a difference between housing and a home, and there's a difference between neighborhood and a community. So even though I changed housing when I was 3 years old, and I changed the neighborhood in which I lived and where I was embedded, my sense of home and my sense of community were actually quite unshakable and hadn't changed much at that time. In the first apartment, there was Miss Eunice and her daughters who would comb my hair and watch me when my mom was away at work. She worked at a elementary school where she cared for special needs kids, and she would walk back and forth to work those days, and so sometimes I would need to be cared for. In the new neighborhood, there was Miss Evelyn, who would also make sure that I got on the bus okay, and I got off the bus okay, and would have warm cookies waiting for this, very excited, very hungry little preschooler. So my community hadn't really changed, and neither had my sense of home. And so in these moments, in the moments where times are good, right, there's a sense of stability that I have to admit that I felt during those years from 0 to 3, and then 3 through kind of grade school, right? And so during those times, I learned the power of people. Rather than thinking of events or circumstances as our defining moment, we really have to think of ourselves and the people around us and those interactions as the defining moments in our lives. In this neighborhood, I was kind of marked as a geek early on. I was nerdy, right? But I was in a community that really embraced that and really supported me. We looked out for one another. We loved one another. And so as a child, I learned the meaning of what it means to give, what it means to love, what it means to support, what it means to be a defining moment in each other's lives. But let's think about when the times aren't so good. The other defining moments that I could see in my life were also these circumstances of kind of institutional or systematic or bad things that can happen, the crises, right? But I don't want to think of those crises as the defining moment, but rather the people that interacted with me during those times as the defining moments in my life. So when I was 8 years old, my father had a heart attack. And from those moments, his life shifted forever. And like many Americans, when we have health crises occur, we really forget how those can really dismantle families, their stability, their financial situation, and everything that comes around our sense of home and our sense of community and our sense of stability and our sense of wellness. So what I learned at that point is I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to identify when I needed help. I didn't know just what I didn't know. And so in those times of crises, right, that's when the defining people in our lives become more important than ever. We operate in a society where we're so used to being so focused on discerning need, who needs help, that we forget that there's ways in which if we could identify where we can extend help to someone in their lives, that it's not really about finding or discerning that need. You can help someone without understanding what their need could be, right? So will you be a defining moment in someone's life? So when I think of issues like Hurricane Katrina, I remember, and I'm going to go back to this issue of housing, and that housing isn't a home. After Katrina, there was a point where I was at Vicksburg, Mississippi. I was in a trailer with 13 other people, and we were there for each other during that time. At the same time, when we left Vicksburg, we then went to Charlotte and stayed with one of my aunts. Again, it was about 13 people in a house. And so while we weren't in a trailer this time and we were in a large house, our housing had changed significantly. That actually wasn't really important. It was about the sense of community and the sense of home that was supporting us during that time of crisis, right? That's what I want us to think about. And that's so central to my own work, because when we think about young people and we think about trying to interrupt and trying to shift opportunity structures for people, I think oftentimes we get focused on the systems and the institutions in place, and we forget that we are the ones who make up those institutions, who make up the systems. We are the people. We are the government. We are America, right? So can you be a defining moment in someone else's life? Can we take care of one another? So often in my classes, we talk about the ways in which America is failing to serve its people. But I ask you, consider the ways in which we could easily be failing to serve one another. If America is failing its people, it's because we are failing one another. I'm not saying that we all go out to a homeless shelter on Thanksgiving Day and serve food to the homeless. That's actually not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, can each of us think about a way in which we could help someone, that we could offer someone support in a way that's not often discerned, in a way that doesn't have to make us rich and famous, in a way that could go unnoticed for so long, but I assure you it could be so promising and so rewarding and so meaningful and more effective than a lifelong struggle to change institutions that we would then argue are too slow to change, right? We're starting a problem where the solution in itself feels impossible. But it is possible to change each other by the little interactions that we have day to day with one another. So when I think about my life, I think about the ways in which there was a time when I was homeless. We were sleeping in the hospital where my father was a patient. He'd had a stroke, right? So my father's had a long history of all types of health crises. And there was a woman named Brenda who walked up to my mother one day when I was at school, and she asked if she could take me, right? I was a teenager. And I know it must have been the hardest decision at all, but my mother said, yeah, you can take me. And so this woman who was a nurse, who had 4 children of her own, took me into her home, and everything changed. It was a defining moment for me, that woman, not being homeless, but Brenda, stepping in to do something for me, right? When I think about high school, I think about the teachers who interacted with me, even though they had no clue that I was homeless, even though they had no sense of the instability in my life, they were helping me just because they could help. And that's we get so caught up in that sometimes, is that we don't help because we can't understand why we should help, or if someone deserves our help, or if someone needs our help. But I really charge you in thinking about, will you be a defining moment, and how can you be a defining moment? What could we do for each other's lives? The list goes on. I could think of a teacher named Miss Hopkins and Miss Walker, who took me aside when I was a young, raging, rebellious adolescent, wearing scantily clad clothes and having no sense of what I was doing with my identity. And they took me aside and they said, let me model for you what it means to be a woman. Let me model for you what it means to be a good citizen. Let me mentor you. And so I'm telling you these short stories to really get at an important point, right, when we point out our own flaws. If I had to ask for help, I probably wouldn't be anything. And that's a pretty strong conviction to say, but I can say it as easily as I could say that if I had to ask for help, maybe I could be something, but I assure you I could very easily be nothing, right? Because let's talk about shame. In this country, the shame of not having And the shame of not knowing, it's so profound, it's so destabilizing, it's so debilitating for so many of us that so many of our failures we probably could attribute to that moment of not having, not knowing, and no one extending a hand when they could, right? These are the ways in which we could actually interrupt, in ways that we could shift, ways that when the research shows that zip code matters, right, that where you're born, the circumstances that you're born into in this country will predict all of your life outcomes. We're so easy to say, let's look at the exceptions. Let's look at Ashley Burns. Let's look at President Obama. Let's look at Colin Powell. Let's look at these exceptions. But instead of looking at the exceptions, instead of just looking at the book with the story already written, with the chapters in place, let's think about the stories and the characters and the narratives and the dialogues that have created the outcomes that we see today. So again, I leave you with this question: will you be a defining moment in someone else's life? Can you go out and just help when you can help? It's not about figuring out who needs it or why they need it or why they deserve it, but the fact that you each have a gift. We all have a gift. There's all something that we can contribute. It doesn't matter how rich we are. It doesn't matter how poor, how dark-skinned we are, how light-skinned we are, where we came from, our status. It doesn't matter. There's all something that we could contribute to make America greater. The way that we can help America better serve its people is if we serve each other in a better way. You think of President John F. Kennedy, who says, we should not think about what our country could do for us, but charge us to think of what we could do for our country. Will you be a defining moment? Will you be a defining moment? Can you prove it? Can you charge it? Can you demand that someone else in your life be a defining moment? If Ms. Hopkins and Ms. Walker and Shandell and Dean Dave and Molly and Evelyn and Brenda and all these people that have been defining moments for me, I'm a defining moment for some people. You're a defining moment for some people. If they can do it, I can do it. You can do it. We can all do it. So will you be a defining moment? Will you make America better? God bless America. Thank you.